Yeah, all right. So, in case anyone was wondering, yes, I am aware that today is Super Bowl Sunday, but I do not have any plans to, quote, get you out early just because of that. So, if you were hoping, I'm sorry. But you may be relieved to know that I also do not have a bunch of Super Bowl themed jokes lined up for you this morning. So, just my normal, really terrible ones. Oh. Last week, as you may recall, as we continued our journey through the life of Moses, we saw him encounter a miraculously burning bush out in the middle of nowhere. Of course, we came to find out that this phenomenon was orchestrated by God so that he could have a little chat with Moses and give him some instructions so that he would go back to Egypt and he would free the Israelites from their bondage to the Egyptians. And we did leave off kind of in the middle of the conversation, which might surprise you because really the conversation should have been over at that point. Like there really was nothing left that needed to be said. God, he introduced himself to Moses. He explained what Moses needed to do. Moses asked what name he should say that God introduced himself as. He expressed his unworthiness to do the task. God said he would go with him. Like, that should have been it, right? We've got the greeting, we've got humility, we've got instructions. It's done. What else should there be to discuss? Well, apparently Moses just wanted to keep this going for about another half a chapter or so, and it doesn't go well. Like anytime you just keep something going longer than it should, it just doesn't work out well. Maybe somewhat, never mind. See, that was almost a Super Bowl joke, and I let it go. Instead, let's go ahead. Exodus 4, we'll start in verse 1. Then Moses said, "What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, 'The Lord has not appeared to you.' And the Lord said to him, 'What is that in your hand?' And Moses said, 'A staff.' Then God said, 'Throw it on the ground.' So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from it. But the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand and grasp it by its tail.' So he stretched out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." So Moses, he begins to get a little exasperating here. The they that we read right in the beginning, it harkens back to the elders of Israel. And God has already told Moses exactly how they're going to react to him coming back. Way back in verse 18 of the last chapter, we read, "They will pay heed to what you say. And you with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God.'" This they is the same they. At this point, Moses' humility is beginning to turn into like blatant unbelief. He's not just being humble about his qualifications. He's now questioning whether God is truly going to be able to deliver on his promise here. And spoiler alert, he's looking for an excuse not to go. Like, he's just going to throw up every possible reason he can think of as to why he shouldn't go. But God's not going to let him off the hook that easily. Moses asks for a sign, and God tells him to throw down his staff. And as it turns into a snake, a real snake, Moses is understandably scared, but amazed, because he then picks the snake up by the tail, and it becomes a staff again. And God continues in verse 6. The Lord furthermore said to him, "Now put your hand into your bosom." So he put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then he said, "Put your hand into your bosom again." So he put his hand into his bosom again, and when he took it out of his bosom, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you or heed the witness of the first sign, they may believe the witness of the last sign. But if they will not believe even these 2 signs or heed what you say, then you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. In total, Moses is given 3 signs, right? First, his staff turning into a snake. Second, his hand becoming leprous and then being healed. And finally, the water of the Nile turned into blood, which he doesn't see demonstrated, but maybe by this point he can trust God a little bit. There are 2 things that I want to point out about these signs, besides them just being awesome exercises of God's power, which frankly they are. And if that's all they were, that would be enough. However, they're more than that. First, they all make use of perfectly ordinary things that Moses would have had on hand, right? And when we look throughout history, we see that God makes a habit of using perfectly ordinary things all the time. Things, in quotes, which he has laying around, if you could describe humans as things, because that's exactly what he does with us, right? We are all perfectly ordinary things that God has laying around. And for some reason, he deems it appropriate to make use of us. Just pick us up and, okay, not turn us into a snake. That wouldn't be a very good analogy. But he just picks us up and he uses us for whatever purpose he may need us for. In this case, he takes a stick and he miraculously turns it into a snake. In some cases, he takes a stick in the mud and miraculously turns them into somebody that is worthy of being listened to about his word. That was like totally off the cuff. I like how that flowed. That's the Holy Spirit right there, guys. I'm the stick in the mud in that analogy, in case you were wondering. There is no special reason that God should use us to accomplish his will or to work or even get to observe his miracles. But he does anyway, which is just amazing. And can we just say thank you for that? Secondly, though, notice that these miracles are more than just miracles. They have a meaning. The first 2 miracles are reversible, right? The first one shows that God has complete control over nature. He takes a stick and he turns it into a snake, and then he turns it back into a stick. That's like most of nature all right there. The second shows that God has complete control over pestilence. He takes Moses and he makes him sick and then he heals him again. Like total control there. Finally, with the third miracle, we see that God has the power of destruction, and he isn't afraid to use it. As the Nile River is ruined by being turned into blood, and it's never returned to its otherwise, quote, pure state. At least back in those days, you must assume the Nile was probably a little more pure than it is today. Pure, right? It's drinkable, at least, until it turns into blood. Anyway, God is sending the message that he is willing to prove himself able to bring ruin and destruction. But if you push him too far, he's not afraid to actually bring ruin and destruction and make those things permanent. Notice how he begins verse 9, if they will not believe those 2 signs or heed what you say. God says destruction is a last resort, but it's not off the table. It is right there. It is available. I will destroy things if I have to. But more than just a meaning to the Israelites and eventually to the Egyptians, you could see a special meaning in these signs for Moses as well, one that is separate from those meanings. You see, if Moses was scared of opposition, well, God has that handled, right? This was a poisonous snake, and God said, hey, take it up. But not just pick it up. No. Pick it up by the tail. That is the most dangerous place you can try and grab a snake. You ever watch a snake handler? Where do they grab a poisonous snake? Right behind the head. That way it can't turn and bite them. If you grab it by the tail, you got that whole snake right there. That's just I'm sorry, Janet, but it is what it is. You got that whole snake right there that can turn around and bite you at any point. God tells Moses, I know you're scared of that snake, right? Moses ran from it. He says, I know you're scared of that snake, but grab it by the tail and watch me protect you. And as soon as Moses grabs it by the tail, it immediately turns back into a stick. God protects Moses even from the harm that could come from him. And this is a sign to Moses that God will protect him even from the harm that may come to him as he takes this message into Egypt. Then secondly, if Moses was scared of his uncleanness or his unworthiness, right? Moses said, I'm not worthy to take this message to Pharaoh. The leprosy that God puts on Moses' hand is then a symbol of Moses' uncleanness, of how he is not worthy, how he shouldn't be allowed to take this message. But then what does God immediately do? He heals him. He cleans him up, which is a symbol of God saying, listen, I know that you're a sinful human. I know that you're not worthy of doing this. I will make you worthy of taking this message. I will make sure the message is unpolluted. God heals him and makes him whole. Frequently, God's messages carry special meaning for the messenger before they ever get to the ears of the intended recipients. Anybody who has led a Bible study or even taught your children or stood up here has felt the weight of those words. I cannot tell you how many Sundays, mostly because I haven't counted every Sunday between now and the day I got ordained. I cannot tell you the number of Sundays where the message that I am teaching you guys hit me hard before I'd ever got to the pulpit. There's always something in there for me too. It's not just you guys. Moses, we must assume, is quite amazed by these signs, but for some reason, he continues on with his objections. Join me in verse 10. Then Moses said to the Lord, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." And the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth, or who makes him mute, or deaf, or seeing, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to say." But Moses said, "Please, Lord, now send the message by whomever you will." And so now we see that Moses is just getting ridiculous. Completely ridiculous, right? We don't really have any evidence about whether Moses had been eloquent up to this point in his life or not, but we do know that he had the opportunity to learn to be eloquent while he was in Egypt, right? He was the prince of Egypt. He was brought up by the best tutors available, and that's probably why we read in the book of Acts, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. Now, obviously, anyone who's read the rest of Exodus knows that Moses becomes a man with powerful words and powerful deeds. But the way this is written implies he was already a man of power and deeds because of the learning in Egypt. Thank you. I was blanked for some reason. It's also interesting, though, that the Hebrew phrase here that's used for slow of tongue is also used in Ezekiel 3:5. But in Ezekiel 3:5, it's translated as difficult speech, or in some translations, strange or foreign language. It almost makes you wonder if Moses isn't trying to cop out of this because he's saying, oh, well, you know, God, I've been in the desert for 40 years in Midian. I can't even remember the last time I spoke Hebrew or Egyptian. I probably don't remember any of the words. I will tell you, it's been a while since I've spoken French, not 40 years, but every once in a while, Anna will come to me, "Dad, how do you say?" And it just pops right into my head. It's like riding a bicycle. Some things you just don't forget very easily. And when you spent the first 40 years of your life speaking a couple of languages, I find it hard to believe that you would have forgotten them like that. Regardless, this is of course a bogus excuse. God calls him out on it, and he promises to bless his language and teach him what he needs to say. But then we finally get to the crux of the issue, as Moses just straight up says, "God, please choose someone else." He's run out of excuses. The only thing he has left to say is, "God, I just don't want to go. Please, someone else, anyone else. I don't care. Just not me, please." And this is the final straw for God. And I would not recommend following in Moses' footsteps, because I have to imagine, we start, verse 14, "Then the anger of the Lord burned against Moses." And I know how terrifying I can be thinking about that right now, but I am not staring face to face with a bush that is on fire and is not being do you guys ever watch The Prince of Egypt? The animated movie that is the story of Moses, right? When it gets to this section, you've got this cute little fire in the bush, and Moses is talking to this fire in the bush, and then he gets here, and the fire in the bush, it doesn't double in size. It doesn't quadruple in size. This fire gets so massive, Moses has to put his hands up, and then you see him being pushed back, he's standing still, but being pushed back away from this because the anger of the Lord is so intense at him at this point. And I cannot imagine being face to face with that. That's terrifying to me. Even the thought of that is terrifying to me. I don't get why Moses pushed so hard. I don't get it. When God came to me and said, hey, by the way, you're going to be the pastor. And I was like, God, are you sure? And he said, yes. I was like, okay, that's the end of this conversation. I expressed my unworthiness. You said you still wanted me to do it. Okay, I'm not going to keep pushing on this because I don't want to be face to face with a burning bush that, becomes massive and might catch me on fire. That doesn't sound like a place that I want to be. But God, he's a little kinder to Moses than Moses deserved, right? As we continue on in verse 14. And God said, is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he speaks fluently. And moreover, behold, he is coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. And you are to speak to him and put the words in his mouth. And I, even I, will be with your mouth and his mouth, and I will teach you what you are to do. Moreover, he shall speak for you to the people, and he will be as a mouth for you, and you will be as God to him. You shall take in your hand this staff with which you shall perform the signs. So God is a little kinder to Moses than, let's be honest, than Moses deserves, right? Moses does not deserve God to say, okay, fine, I'll let your brother help you out. But while Moses, I'm sure, is doing maybe a little bit of a cheer or a little bit of a dance here because he may feel like he's gotten his way, what he doesn't understand is that Aaron is not going to help Moses nearly as much as Moses thinks he's going to help Moses. Aaron ends up becoming a really big pain, and we'll leave it there. A massive hindrance, a big stumbling block, not just to Moses, but to the people of Israel as a rule. He's not great. And really, this is probably the reason God didn't come to Aaron in the first place, right? There's a reason God chose Moses and not Aaron. And we'll see as we continue to study through Exodus all of the reasons, or at least many of the reasons, why Moses was the better choice and Aaron falls short. I'm not saying Aaron was a terrible person, but he wasn't a great person either. Aaron may have been good at talking, but he was not good at listening to God. And he was not good at, Moses has his issues obeying God, but Aaron's are compounded. And so we'll see that this eventually becomes an issue. Sorry, spoilers again. With this, though, Moses offers no further objections that we can see, and he goes to seek his father-in-law's blessing on the endeavor. Verse 18. Then Moses departed and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go, that I may return to my brethren who are in Egypt, and see if they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Now the Lord said to Moses and Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons and mounted them on a donkey and returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses also took the staff of God in his hand. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. So again, Moses, even though he is on a mission from God, doesn't want to just leave Jethro high and dry. Moses seeks his blessing before taking off. And though we don't know how much of the burning bush experience Moses communicates to Jethro, we can be pretty well assured that God would have paved the way for Jethro's blessing on this endeavor. Because remember that Jethro himself knows God. Jethro worships God. He is described to us as the priest in Midian, the priest of God. So he's not somebody who is unaccustomed to listening to God. So if this is what God wants Moses to do, you have to know that God would have come to Jethro or at least softened his heart towards the idea of Moses going to Egypt. Then we get to verse 21. Which I'm sure some people would like some answers about. I get it. Truly, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and what role God plays in it is one of the most challenging parts of the Exodus account. I'd argue it's even more challenging to people's faith than the judgments or the miracles, because nobody really questions whether or not Pharaoh and the Egyptians deserve to be punished for their treatment of the Israelites and their refusal to let them go free. But when it seems like God might have forced Pharaoh to not let the Israelites go, it seems a little unfair. I can understand that. That makes sense. I totally get it. So let me assure you that free will existed even in Pharaoh's case. He made his own choices. If you've read through or maybe listened to teaches through the plagues before, then you've probably already know that around some of the plagues we see that Pharaoh hardened his heart, and around other plagues we see God hardened Pharaoh's hearts, and around a few of the plagues Pharaoh's heart was hardened without any named cause. It doesn't say whether it was God or whether it was Pharaoh. Interestingly, there are at least 2 different phrases being translated in these cases. Typically, when we see that Pharaoh is hardening his own heart, the word kabad is used. And this word can be translated as being honored or as honoring oneself. And this often comes after Pharaoh has convinced Moses to provide relief from one of the plagues. So we see Pharaoh, he convinces Moses to provide relief from a plague, and then he is so proud of himself for getting one over on Moses that he refuses to let the Israelites go. That's kind of the general understanding when Pharaoh hardened his heart and decided the Israelites couldn't go. It's like, oh, hey, I've got power over Moses, so why should I let them go? And he's kind of puffing himself up. But when we see Pharaoh's heart being hardened by God or by an unnamed force, it's usually the word kazad. If I said that right, I don't know, because like a dummy, I put the actual words instead of the pronunciation guide. Oh well. This word can also be translated as strengthening or making resolute. So basically, we have a situation where Pharaoh is constantly trying to prove himself to be greater, smarter, more powerful than God and than Moses. And when he feels like he is, he puffs himself up. And then God allows him to be ever more resolute in his feelings until the time comes for God to show him just how wrong he is. We still have this situation where Pharaoh is puffing himself up, where Pharaoh is under the impression that he's winning out. And so he is deciding for himself that he's going to be anti-God, that he is better. God just doesn't show him the error of his ways until it reaches a certain point. You guys make sense? You understand? Spoilers again. But that's what God is referring to in verse 21, right? Remember, he knows the beginning from the end. So he knows how Pharaoh is going to respond to his request for the Israelites to go free. He knows that Pharaoh won't even allow them to leave temporarily to offer sacrifices, much less permanently to go conquer the land of Canaan. And so when God says here that he's going to strengthen Pharaoh's resolve, so to speak, it's because he knows that Pharaoh is going to spend this whole time trying to one-up God. And God's just not going to be able to let that slide, because eventually he has to keep his promise to the Israelites and let them out of Egypt. I stumbled across a webcomic at one point, and a quote from one of the pages leapt to mind as I was studying through this. No love potion in the world can create feelings out of nothing. It can only amplify feelings which were already there. Now, of course, love potions aren't actually a thing, but it's the general understanding of the idea that I'm trying to convey to you guys, right? God doesn't cause Pharaoh to hate the Israelites or to refuse to let them go, but God also did not prevent Pharaoh from developing those feelings, and he definitely ended up using those feelings in order to accomplish his purposes. Not just the freeing of the Israelites, but also making a statement about the power and presence of their God to everybody in the world at the time. Again, spoilers. That becomes important later, so just kind of file it away in your mind. Anyway, verse 24. Now it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet. And she said, "You are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. At the time she said, "You are a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision." Now I won't say that this is the second most challenging part of Exodus, but it is certainly among the most confusing parts of Exodus. There's not a lot of information given. And a lot of people infer a lot of things from just these three little verses. And I agree, there are definitely things that we can reasonably infer, but there's other things which we just don't know, right? Like, it is clear that at least one of Moses' sons was not circumcised prior to this point. That's evident because you can't circumcise if they're already circumcised. Like, sorry, like that's clear, it's done, right? Circumcision, you may recall, is an important symbol of the covenant with God. That's why it's important here. If one of Moses' children isn't circumcised, then that child cannot be an heir to the promise. That child, if you read all the way back, should be cut off from his people because he isn't circumcised. So for Moses to go off as a defender of this covenant, as a representative of God, but then to not have his own house properly in order, that's not okay. That is like beyond not okay. Even in the New Testament, we see very strong prohibitions about people being in a place of authority within the church and not having their house properly in order. Like, it is important to God that a man is taking care of his responsibility with regards to his family if he has one. And even a lady is taking care of her responsibilities with regards to her family, assuming that she has one. This is important to God. Families and the way that they operate matters. And so we see here that God contends with Moses, and we see seeks to kill him because, again, he doesn't have his house properly in order. It's entirely possible that somewhere before this point, God had reminded Moses, hey, don't forget, you need to do something with your kid who's not circumcised. At a minimum, like Moses would have known, he spent 40 years in Egypt, but also with his family. We see as he leaves Egypt, he knows God. He knows the traditions of his people. It's not like, oh, I forgot that my kid needs to be circumcised. I find that really, really hard to believe. Secondly here, we can see that Zipporah is very angry about something, right? Whether it's the whole situation or it's that she had to circumcise the boy. We don't know for sure what she's angry about, but we can make a couple of guesses, right? Many people believe that Zipporah was against circumcising infants. Now, this kind of is not a terrible leap because in that time frame, like we discussed, there were people being circumcised because there's nothing new under the sun. People try things and whatever. So there were people getting circumcised, but only the Israelites were circumcising infants. When you look back through what we have learned of history so far, nobody was circumcising infants. Nobody was taking 8-day-old boys and doing this. Only the Israelites were doing it. So whether Zipporah was specifically against circumcising infants or she was completely against circumcision, we don't know. There is some evidence that within the culture of the Midianites, circumcision happened. Remember, these guys are still descended from Abraham. But the evidence suggests that it doesn't happen until a man is getting ready for marriage, which, can I just say, ouch? Like, man, that just does not seem like a thing that I would want to be dealing with as I was preparing to get married. But if we assume that she has something against infant circumcision, whether it's because it's infants or because it's circumcision, if we assume that, then it explains her anger, right? Because not only did both of her children end up getting circumcised, against her wishes perhaps, but she had to do it herself. Moses didn't take care of his responsibility as the father to either do it or get it done. And so now, out in the middle of nowhere, his wife has to do it for him. Which, on the one hand, good on Zipporah, right? Because she took care of what needed to be done, even though Moses wouldn't do it. On the other hand, she shouldn't have had to. Like, it's not her responsibility to make sure that the family is right with God. That responsibility rests squarely on Moses' shoulders. And I hate to say it, I don't hate to say it, I hate to point it out maybe, but guys, that still remains true today. The responsibility of making sure that your family is right with God rests squarely on your shoulders. And if you are relying upon your wife to accomplish that, you need to stop. It's not going to go well for you. And I'm not looking at any particular guy, but I am certain that if this is you, the Holy Spirit is inspiring you to think very carefully about your life and the decisions that have led you to this point. Because there is still time to turn it around. I promise you, no woman actually wants to be in the place where they are the spiritual head of the household. None of them do. No matter how they act, no matter what they say, none of them wants to be in that position. And I know this because God has ordained it a certain way. We see this all the way back in Genesis. Remember last year we studied through Genesis, and it's very clearly there. The woman will seek after the man's position, but she doesn't actually want it because it's not hers to have. It is yours to have, man. So take it and do it because you're supposed to. If for no other reason than because you're supposed to. But I can tell you the myriad of reasons why it's important for you to take an active role in your house. If you really need me to. Yeah, I just scattered all over this section. It's great. Verse 27. Look, Shell, I'm just making sure that I didn't skip over any of the points that I wanted to make regarding this section because it's important. I appreciate it. I do. All right, so again, there is a lot of things that people infer from this just 3 little verses, some of which you can kind of get out of the passage, some of which you can't. So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong about some of the things. It's hard to say for sure. But after this matter is handled, we see that Moses is allowed to continue on the journey. So take from that what you will. Now we will jump into verse 27. Thank you, Shell. Now the Lord said to Aaron, "Go to meet Moses in the wilderness." So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord, with which he had sent him and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the sons of Israel, and Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. He then performed the signs in the sight of the people. So the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord was concerned about the sons of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, then they bowed low and worshiped. So really, at the end of the day, we see Moses maybe learning some of the lessons that he probably should have already learned, right? He struggles with obedience, but God knocks a little bit of sense into him. Maybe it was that fight in the middle of the wilderness. God knocked him against a wall or something, and he's like, oh, hey, maybe I should, do what I'm supposed to do. Maybe. But he gets all the way to meet up with Aaron, and he properly communicates the message to Aaron. Then they go back to Egypt, they meet with the elders, and they then communicate God's message to the leaders of Israel. And we see that they have no issue of convincing them of what the mission is. Gee, if only someone had told them that wouldn't be a problem, maybe they could have saved themselves a little bit of heartache. That's right, God did. And then we see that the Israelites are thrilled, right? Here they are. It's been 400 years that they have been in Egypt, that they've been struggling, slaving away, and now they have proof, not just words, right? Not just Joseph's casket sitting above ground in a really creepy way. No, they have actual proof that God is listening to them, that God has heard their cries, and that God wants to rescue them from Egypt. Because Moses showed up as a prophet of God, and he brought proof with him. Like, maybe they would have needed it, maybe they wouldn't have, but they have it, and it's awesome because God is also awesome. And isn't that amazing? I mean, really, because we have that same proof, right? If we just flip forward, 50 books or so, we get to Jesus, who came to save us in much the same way that Moses came to save the Israelites. And he brought proof with him because he was crucified on the cross and he was resurrected. And even when he gets to the upper room, and we have Thomas who floats in and says, well, I'm not going to believe that Jesus is resurrected until I see proof, until I see his hands, until I see his side, until I know for sure that this, in fact, was the same Jesus that was crucified. And Jesus shows up and gives him proof. And so we can vicariously, through Thomas, experience that proof as well. But then we're told right there in that very same section that blessed are those who have not seen but believe anyway, which is us. Right? The Israelites, they had the proof that Moses brought them. They had the miracles, and we'll see that even with that, they will struggle as we go on. But we don't have to struggle because we can believe. I mean, they could have believed, but we can also believe. And so we'll dig into that a little more next week, but that'll be next week's problem and not this week's problem. So, all righty. There we go. That is Exodus 4.